This morning's deliberations are again a part of our focus on A Weary World Rejoices. I begin this morning by asking a series of questions, not for answers per se, but for reflection. What caught your attention as Vicki was reading these verses? If you've heard this story before, you may have largely shut off with the unconscious thought, oh, I've heard that one before. Do you tend to listen for familiar details and allow your mind to run ahead to the place that you've labeled the climax of the story? Or do you listen intently for every nuance and perhaps for something new? Another way to ask that question may be, are you a person whose mind prefers familiar places, the rhythms, the images, the narratives that are repeated? Or is your mind curious about the words you've never noticed before, connections that are new and fresh, at least to you, exploring sights and sounds and smells that uncover new layers of meaning? How well does your imagination work? Think about stories or news reports, observations of events of someone else's life. Can you imagine others' lives like yours? When you hear about someone whose experiences differ from your own, do you find yourself observing at a distance, mentally, cognitively, or do you feel as if you're directly in the middle of the action? Your answers to these questions may influence in how you understand biblical texts, such as was read from Luke chapter 1. Your answers may provide clues into how well you are able to see new possibility in the texts that you read. It may even be helpful in determining whether you can find joy in a weary world. This week, we're again given a few paragraphs about Mary, the mother of Jesus' life. A life that is filled with meaning and tumult, the upending of dreams and overwhelming joy. The verses can be read in just a few minutes, yet they convey a profound human experience. Everything is upended in the story that we just heard. If you recall last week's scripture and sermon, you'll remember the message that Mary received from the angel Gabriel. Not exactly the kind of message a young woman planning her wedding would want to receive. This week's text gives us another experience to ponder. It opens with the words, "in those days." Those few words could easily be regarded as throwaway fillers, kind of like people use or like when they're looking for the next best word or phrase to continue their thought. You could look at these words describing this particular period of Joseph and Mary's life, or you could approach it from the political, societal perspective. Neither the personal nor the societal context were stable for ordinary people in those days. Because of a dream, Joseph had not broken off the engagement to Mary once he learned of her pregnancy. Already that speaks to a tension in that relationship. Their lives will have been subjected to community surveillance, scrutiny, complete with gossip and rejection by some, I'm sure. Politically and societally, since we're speaking of members of the Jewish population here, it's safe to say that even during periods of relative stability between wars, with all of those atrocities, this minority people group always felt the significant discomfort of being subjected to hostile Roman governance. Everyday life was marked by the tension of external control. This and so much more is embedded in these three words, "in those days." The next words we encounter are ordering and instructed. Coming back to what we've just said about life under Roman domination, The Jewish people's discomfort would have been further escalated by the demand that they too had to be counted by a foreign and a non-Jewish authority. This order will have been regarded as an infringement on their religious autonomy, certainly requiring them to travel on and being displaced during a Sabbath or many Sabbaths, thereby causing increased hardship and tension between ordinary people and Roman authorities. But they were given no choice. They were ordered, and they received instruction of how to comply with this disruptive decree. The level and ease of mobility during this period in history was far from what it is today. So we can only imagine what kind of disruption will have been created along the paths and the trails and the roads where everyone had to be moving into the proximity of their ancestral towns. Apart from the chaos, economic hardship would have increased dramatically. Joseph went to register with Mary, his espoused wife, who was pregnant. This phrase invites us deeper into this couple's personal experience. Not only had they endured the upheaval surrounding by the announcement of Mary's pregnancy, now, mere months later, they needed to travel during the final months of this same pregnancy. Travel, meaning getting all that they would need for this journey of undefined duration together onto a donkey or two or three, and to reserve some space on one of those donkeys for someone who was in the late stages of pregnancy, probably 8 months or more. Of course, there were no restaurants or drive-thrus, so who knows how much food they had to pack to take along with themselves, and to what degree they would need to rely on the kindness of strangers along the way. All of that would have produced enormous strength. So obviously this journey was ill-advised. Yet those in power cared nothing about individual hardship or danger to the lives of women or children or anyone for that matter. Because of the complete chaos that masses of people on foot and with beasts of burden would create, the time that this actual census would take could never have been predicted. It was while they were there, this undisclosed, undefined, undesired time frame, it was then, in this liminal space, during which they had no comforts and no guarantees, during that period of time, Mary's time to deliver came. And we are told she gave birth. Seriously? Is that all? She gave birth? That's all the writer could say about what happened? Who was there besides Joseph? How did he manage in makeshift accommodations in space also housing cattle? Evidently, Mary had brought something for the baby, but it seems minimal. A simple cloth, we're told. This is hardly the entrance one would have anticipated back then when the angel Gabriel gave Mary this message: "You'll conceive and bear a son and give him the name Jesus. His dignity will be great, and he will be called the only begotten of God. God will give Jesus the judgment seat of David, his ancestor, to rule over the house of Jacob forever, and his reign will never end." And she gave birth. Just the facts, no elaboration or instruction or detail. What happens when a prediction or a promise seems magnificent and grand and consequential, and when it actually comes to pass, it bears absolutely no resemblance to the promise and is far from elegant and certainly not enjoyable? I'm cold, I'm scared, I'm anxious, I'm hungry and thirsty and lonely just reading about this. What if it had been me or my daughter? How would I or we have fared? How about you? These details are very easily overlooked as we rush to find meaning and make a story into a liturgy or a singable carol or a lofty prayer proclaiming joy. If we never look behind or beneath the lean words of information, we can never experience the enormity of what it meant for actual, real people like Mary, like Joseph, like all of the people who were uprooted from their homes to trek to who knows where because someone with authority decided to exercise power over his subordinates in order to bolster his own confidence and sense of importance. If we do not bring curiosity to each text, we will miss most of its meaning. If we skip over the question of what was going on at that point in history, or what if, or how did that happen, or what would that have felt like, we fail to consider what was really happening and what it meant and what it means for ordinary people. If we leave it at a brief summary of an event, we are content with singing Silent Night and moving right along. Or we're in danger of becoming completely disillusioned with the whole thing, thinking religion has nothing to do with who I am and how I live. In order to have some relevance in the 21st century, and more specifically in Advent 2024, we must find out what it could mean to find joy in a weary world of forced compliance. What shape could love have taken when pushed into a drafty stable to give birth to a firstborn who had been promised? In honesty, we all have to acknowledge the stark truth that we routinely overlook things, sometimes the most obvious things, other times the quiet whispers that invite further notice. Often we overlook the most important things. I invite you to recall an observation about Mary that we made through last week's text and sermon. For Mary to come to a place of accepting the announcement of her impending pregnancy, which would result in the birth of Jesus, she had to have spent hours pondering and becoming familiar with transcendence. Before that, after the announcement, she walked for days and ultimately discovered new faces of and new experiences with the divine. This couldn't have happened without deliberate determination to invest the time. Mary knew how to pay attention, to ponder, and to recognize awe and wonder when she encountered it. She stands as a silent, unassuming beacon on a shore overlooking crashing waves and threatening riptides. She invites us into this place of observant, wide-awake serenity. Our frenzied, scheduled, and ever-occupied lifestyle contributes to routinely overlooking important things. That may sound like a hollow assertion, but think about it for a minute. What have you missed as you sped along a freeway, or driven 3 blocks to a store instead of walking to it, or slept 30 minutes longer rather than to spend time in meditation, breathing, being still, and in inviting divine presence? I'm just as guilty of all of that as anyone. Curiosity is born if we tune in to the ordinary, which then becomes extraordinary. Insight comes when we are no longer satisfied with the quick reading of important scriptures rather than allowing them to soak deeply into our souls. Understanding of the world around us comes when we can see parallels in history, such as this story with Mary and Joseph being ordered by an oppressive authoritarian to do something that would upend their lives without regard to economic hardship or personal danger. This is what is happening hundreds and thousands of times every day, every week, every month in this country. Decisions made in distant offices slam into everyday, ordinary lives. Health insurance companies deny claims for coverage with staggering frequency, leaving untold numbers of people devastated. Legislative bodies roll back protective orders, further threatening our quality of air, our water, safe habitat for our children and wildlife alike. Others' opinions or our own myopic vision of ourselves, our church, our community, whittles everything down within and around us to the diminutive replicas of what we could be or become. All of this threatens our ability to experience joy while being weary, unless we learn with Mary to recognize transcendence within the dark place, the uncomfortable space. Circling back to the questions from the outset, how well does your imagination work? Is your mind curious about things that seem foreign to you, or things you've never noticed before? Can you see in the dark, in the place that feels destructive, but that certainly holds divinity? Our answers to these questions influence whether we can find relevance in biblical texts for ourselves and for the world in which we live. Our answers will give insight into how well we are able to see new possibility in our own world. I invite you to come with Mary into this place of observant, wide-awake curiosity and serenity, above the crashing waves and the threatening riptides. If we are not fully awake and alert, inviting mystery with curiosity, we will shrink to become the smallest possible versions of ourselves. We will settle for the bare minimum. We will not even expect well-being outside of what is familiar. None of this is consistent with Advent, the message of hope and peace and joy and love. In closing, I invite another Mary, the poet Mary Oliver, to help us understand. Instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. May it be so.